Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. As Ruth said, my name is Dr. Andrew Foxall. I am Director of the Russian Studies Centre at the Henry Jackson Society and an analyst with strategic analysis. And what I want to do with this in the next sort of 10, 12 minutes or so is to outline a number of key themes or key developments that we've seen in Russia over recent years. For those of you who are active in Russia, I hope they will be useful. For those of you who aren't active, I hope they will at least be interesting. And I want to do that by looking at the political sphere, the security sphere, and the economic sphere as well. The first key trend I think that we see goes back as far as 2000, after President Putin initially rose to power in the Kremlin. He, of course, assumed the leadership of Russia after President Yeltsin unexpectedly stood down on New Year's Eve 1999. President Putin became the acting president. He was previously prime minister and was democratically elected the leader of the Russian Federation in March 2000. One of the first things that President Putin did was go about reasserting the centrality of Moscow within the Russian political system at the expense of the regions. He looked at Russia in the 1990s and the experience of market liberalization, of democracy, of all of the Western ills that he would associate with the 1990s, and came to the conclusion that Moscow, and more specifically the Kremlin, needed more power. This, as I say, he undertook from the summer of 2000 onwards with a number of legal, administrative, governmental, structural reforms. This intensified to a certain extent after the Beslan school hostage siege in September of 2004, which some of you may remember, led by a group of Chechen rebels who took hostage a school in Beslan, a city and town indeed in North Ossetia in the North Caucasus. Over 700 people, mostly children, were held hostage, and approximately 350, 400 children were subsequently killed after a botched rescue operation by the Russian secret services. But Putin used Beslan as an excuse to further centralize the system. He got away, or rather removed, the direct election of regional governors and undertook again a number of administrative reforms, centralized Russia and the Russian administrative system on the basis of Russia's 7 military districts, appointed a plenipotentiary presidential envoy to each, and really removed the last vestiges of democracy in the country. And we've seen that again since Putin was re-elected, or rather elected, in 2012. There's been the vast centralization of the Russian political system to the point where politically, economically, geographically, culturally, all power resides both through the person of Putin and through his personal networks, the so-called inner circle of both Putin oligarchs and the Siloviki. And all of the other, or certainly the other four key political trends, really also we begin to see developing in 2000. So, for example, the marginalization of opposition figures. We see that initially with the annexation or appropriation, perhaps, of Vladimir Gruzhinsky's Media Most empire in the summer of 2000. That is then, of course, given extra substance by the subsequent imprisoning of Mikhail Khodorkovsky of Yukos fame, subsequently, of course, released in December of last year. But we also see it in terms of the political sphere, the forcing abroad of or into prison of high-profile political opponents, not least Khodorkovsky, Boris Nemtsov, for example, Mikhail Kasyanov. Less than a month ago, the most high-profile political opposition figure, Alexei Navalny, was placed under house arrest, and it appears as though he will now be in prison for the next 5 years. on botched, politically motivated charges of stealing timber from a state-controlled timber factory in the Kirov region in central Russia. That follows on the marginalisation of civil and political liberties, a complete intolerance indeed of human rights, or indeed rights that are in any way in opposition to the Kremlin and what the Kremlin says. Again, we saw this from 2000, but this has intensified since President Putin was re-elected as president in 2012. Many of you may well be aware of the so-called Foreign Agents Law, a law that was passed in July 2012 at the same time as the so-called Gay Propaganda Law. The Foreign Agent Law forces NGOs, Western NGOs, to register as foreign agents in Russia and to admit that they push the geopolitical line of their backers, many of whom are Western governments, even if indeed they don't do so. If they don't register as foreign agents, they're closed down by the state. The judiciary, in addition to that, is largely controlled by the Kremlin, and there is, for all intents and purposes, no rule of law in Russia. We also see increasing anti-Western sentiments as a result of the manipulation of, or the long-term manipulation of nationalist sentiments in Russia. This isn't simply manifest in anti-Western or anti-American sentiment. It's also manifest in increasing ethnic relations or ethnic conflict, ethnic tension in Russia itself. And finally, or the last political trend that I would raise with you is an opposition to undertake any reforms necessary to change the situation, because those reforms are seen by the Kremlin as a threat not only to the country's stability, but also to the Kremlin's power itself. Reforms, in a sense, are seen as a personal threat to Putin. And certainly, I think at least one way that one could interpret the events in Ukraine and Crimea over recent weeks and months is that Putin saw what was happening in Ukraine, saw the upswell of civil society, of social unrest and social opposition to what was clearly a grotesquely corrupt system, and wondered, indeed not worried, that that may happen in Russia as well. So those are key political trends. In terms of economic trends, I think the first trend that we would see is decreasing economic growth, largely due to over reliance on energy exports and chronic underinvestment. Russia's reliance on natural resources is, of course, historical and, at least in one respect, entirely understandable, or at least not surprising. It's one of the largest two oil producers in the world and the world's largest gas producer, produces approximately 12% of the world's oil and about 20% of the world's gas. But that independence or overdependence has increased markedly since 2000, when President Putin came to power. In 2000, natural resources accounted for approximately 30% of Russia's GDP, and in 2013, last year, it accounted for almost 60%. That chronic underinvestment is largely because Russia's growth since 2000 was rather too easy. It was based on high prices of oil and gas and other hydrocarbons internationally, which meant that Russia didn't have to institutionally reform its economy, which was, of course, heavily industrialized in the 1990s and still over-reliant on oil and gas. The 2009 global economic crisis, which of course hit most Western economies, hit Russia particularly acutely. Its GDP decreased by 8%, the largest drop in the G20 nations. Pervasive corruption is also something else that one might think of as being characteristic of the Putinist system. Rife, of course, during the 1990s as Russia struggled to adopt to a market economy, corruption, or certainly the black market, has increased markedly since then. Estimates suggest that in 2005, corruption accounted for approximately $320 billion US dollars, or approximately a quarter of Russia's then economy. And despite high-profile anti-corruption initiatives, not least President Dmitry Medvedev's anti-corruption campaign launched in 2008. Corruption has increased since then. In 2012, the World Bank suggested that corruption of the black market accounted for approximately half of Russia's GDP, which is to say $967 billion US. What we've seen alongside this is what analysts, certainly economists, would call state dirigism, whereby state it controls, or at least in large part controls, or has outright control over key industrial sectors. Of course, that is true in oil and gas, but it's also true elsewhere, not least in terms of construction and domestic transport systems as well. So companies controlled by Putin indirectly, or by Putin's inner circle, the so-called Putin oligarchs, which are slightly different to the Yeltsin oligarchs of the 1990s, have vast control over Russia's key economies. One might think of perhaps Igor Sechin, who's head of Rosneft, Alexei Miller of Gazprom, Gennady Timchenko of the Gunva oil trading firm, or somebody like Vladimir Yakunin, who's head of Russia Railways. What we've seen as a result of Russia's actions in Ukraine is increased market uncertainty and increased capital outflow. Again, these are trends that we've really seen since 2009, but have intensified over recent months. In the first 3 months of this year, for example, capital outflow in Russia was approximately $70 billion US, which is the same as for the whole of 2012 and 2013 put together. Markets, financial markets, dislike uncertainty, and Russia's actions are certainly uncertain at the moment. And we're seeing increasing international isolation, certainly since 2008, when the speaker before me, of course, showed the picture of the Russia's flag, rust-proof iron flag planted on the Arctic seabed in August 2008. Since then, we've seen Russia increasingly isolated internationally. Over recent months, of course, we've seen that with the Organization for Economic and Cooperation and Development suspending or halting Russia's accession talks. Russia has been thrown out of the G8, and one might expect in the not-too-distant future that the World Trade Organization would halt or suspend Russia's membership there as well. In terms of key security trends that we see in Russia, if you thought the KGB was all powerful and pervasive during the Soviet period, it would be true to say that the FSB and other successor security organs of the KGB are vastly powerful now in Russia. They maintain the prestige and immense funding that the KGB enjoyed during the Soviet era, but now have widespread political and economic influence. Virtually all the key positions in Russia's economy and in Russian politics are controlled by the Siloviki, which is to say a group of former members of the security services whom are close to President Putin. We've also seen over recent months an important development in terms of Russia's domestic insurgency. So in mid-March, the head of the Emirate Caucasus, or the Caucasus Emirate, for a long time the main source of Russia's domestic insurgency, died. Doku Umarov was replaced. Doku Umarov, who was a Chechen and was radicalized during the two Chechen wars, was replaced by a gentleman who's taken the name of Ali Abu Mohammed, who is a Dargin from Dagestan, a republic that neighbours Chechnya in the North Caucasus. And that is telling because historically insurgents from Dagestan have been far more globalized and far more keen on Russia's domestic insurgency becoming part of the global jihad than their Chechen brethren were. We saw, as a result of the 2008 war, Russia's 2008 war with Georgia, that the Russian military wasn't in a particularly good state, and immediately after that war ended, President Dmitry Medvedev announced that Russia would modernize its military. That is now taking form Russia has a vast conventional forces. Its army numbers about 850,000 people, but its technological capabilities are not what they once were. The modernization program aims to replace between 70 and 75% of Russia's armaments and technical capabilities by 2020, and Russia plans to spend over $700 billion doing that. And we are seeing at least now, as a result of the build-up of Russian forces on Ukraine's eastern border, that it has modernized its military. The frequent provocation of Western powers that really dates back to 2007 and Putin's aggressive speech at the Munich Security Conference has increased over recent years. Not only is Russia increasingly overstepping its boundaries and borders in the Arctic, it has also, for example, stifled Western action in Syria, supported Iran's nuclear program, expanded its military influence in Middle East and Northern Africa, and used its geopolitical clout to bully, economic and geopolitical clout to bully the sovereignty of independent states in Eastern Europe. And that, I think, is part of a broader, increasingly neo-imperialist stance that we see in Russian foreign policy. So all of that being said, what can we expect in the future? Economic stagnation and possible recession, it would seem to me, is at least one thing that we can expect with a great deal of certainty. Russia rebounded relatively successfully from the 2008-2009 global economic crisis, but since then its economy has been doing pretty poorly. A little over 4% growth in 2011, a little over 3% growth in 2012, a little over 1% growth last year, and we could expect negative economic growth this year. If, as increasingly it looks like, the crisis in Ukraine continues, and I think we could expect Russia's increasing isolation internationally, we could expect increased and tougher sanctions from the European Union and the United States. As that isolation increases, Putin will probably continue to surround himself by hardliners as part of his inner circle. Certainly the economic liberal and politically liberal members of that inner circle are no longer there. Dmitry Medvedev is no longer as influential as he once was. Alexei Kudrin, the Minister of Finance between 2000 and 2011, is no longer there. What we are seeing is people like Sergei Ivanov, Igor Sechin, who are members of the Siloviki, who will really tell Putin what he wants to hear. As I say, because of the way that events in Ukraine look like they're going, we could expect to see further Western sanctions. Russia will, and we've seen over the last few days, probably try to replace West with East. President Putin is at the moment relatively confident that negotiations, or a decade-long negotiations for a gas deal with China will be concluded, and that will open up the Eastern Front for Russia. There are reasons, I think, to be sceptical of that, not least that China still does not want to pay the price for Russian gas that Russia wants China to pay. And I would really caveat what I've said in the last 14 minutes by saying that the President Putin, who we see in the Kremlin now, is unlike any President Putin who we've seen, or any Prime Minister Putin who we've seen over the last 14, 15 years. Russia's annexation of Crimea, together with its broader destabilization of Ukraine, I think broader stabilization of Ukraine, in which Russia clearly opposes the international system and the Western post-World War II order, means that Russia and the West once again appear to be set, at least, on a new, relatively divisive and possibly dangerous path in which Russia and the West have completely opposite worldviews. I'll finish there. Thank you.
Okay, so any questions, please, David?
So David Jenkins, Chartered Resources. Well, how do you see the future for the big oil companies that are there now? Shell was quite upbeat last week, and of course BP's there, Exxon's there. How do you see the future for them?
Well, I mean, I think what one really ought to bear in mind is what happened with, or potentially what can happen if things go wrong. We saw that with the Sakhalin 2 project in the middle of the 2000s. A project that was initially encouraged, at least by the Russian state, suddenly became against the interests of the Russian state, and subsequently Western investors lost an awful lot of money. I think the same, or what is true with oil and gas firms, Western oil and gas firms currently operating in Russia, is true with non-oil and gas Western firms operating there, which is that if one plays by the rules of the game, and that's Mr. Putin's game, then there are, of course, vast profits to be made. But the moment something goes wrong or Putin changes the rules of the game, then an awful lot of people will lose an awful lot of money.
I have two questions. The first question, it is fair to say, well, that the political risk community has by and large failed to foresee the Crimean crisis. And my question is, how can this failure be explained? The second question is to do with the Black Sea's maritime boundaries. How the change in the maritime boundaries will change the balance of power of future offshore oil and gas exploration in Ukraine? Thank you.
Okay, I'll take the first question first. Political risk community failed to predict, in a sense, the Crimea crisis. In large part it did, and I wouldn't blow my own trumpet at all. I'm from the black country and we're traditionally very modest. But in late February, in a piece for City IM, I did argue that Russia would use military force in Crimea, that it would take Crimea, and that it would probably seek to destabilise eastern Ukraine in the long term. So some people didn't predict it, but others did. But I would simply sort of footnote that by saying the vast majority of people didn't predict the fall of the Soviet Union either in 1999, 1990, 1991, but others did as well. So there are always exceptions to the rule.
So how this failure can be explained?
How can it be explained? I would say that a whole academic discipline called Kremlinology and Sovietology grew up in the 1980s and the 1990s, seeking to answer that question that you just posed. I think at least in one part, everybody, I think, or certainly not everybody, but a large number of people are interested really in maintaining the status quo, rather than looking at how the curve might change in the future. I think an awful lot of people looked at Crimea in February and thought, oh, President Putin would never want to annex Crimea. But actually, if one looks back at what he'd been saying about Crimea and Ukraine over recent years, then actually, in hindsight, it was probably relatively easy to predict. There's a danger, of course, using hindsight and using data to retrospectively fit the conclusions that we now have. But as I say, I don't think people perhaps realised at the time that this was such a significant turn in the global order that we've seen. In terms of the Black Sea, of course, Ukraine, as well as some Western oil companies, have significant interests in hydrocarbon exploration in the Black Sea region. Gazprom has taken control of what Ukraine's interests were, using the argument of Russia now controls Crimea and therefore its exclusive economic zone, so on and so forth, now belongs to the Russian state. How that will change in the future, I don't know. It's not an issue I've looked at in any great detail, I must say.
Well, my name is Kirsten from KR Enviro Consult. I must say that was an interesting presentation. And I must say that in response, I might say, there might be similar criticism over the past say, towards the US for their removal of a democratic president in the Congo, Patrice Lumumba, which has led to the worst human rights abuses on this planet.
Yep.
We could also point to the continued existence of Guantanamo, of course. We could ask whether, if Scotland votes to be independent and then joins Ireland, whether we should blame Ireland. Further, I'd like to point out that the instability in the Ukraine...
Sorry. Listen, you've been here before and you've failed last time we were here to actually ask a question rather than give a speech. And if you have a question, would you please ask it?
Okay, I will ask a question. I would like to know how it is helpful to stability in this world and the potential for divisiveness to encourage isolationism towards Russia rather than to perhaps provide a deeper analysis. Thank you.
I would agree with some of the points that you made as part of, well, prior to your question. I think that, you know, one could present many of the arguments that I've presented with regards to Russia, with regards to the US, with regards to the UK, with regards to Iraq, with regards to Afghanistan, with regards to Northern Ireland, so on and so forth. I wholly agree with the sentiment that you were getting at. So I wouldn't disagree with that. I am not and would not argue for isolation of Russia. I think that in how we deal with Russia now, some of the greatest lessons that we have going forward is how we dealt with the Soviet Union. One of the most subversive acts that the West undertook during the Cold War was to liberalise that visa regimes with Russia as part of cultural exchange programs, whereby Russian Soviet citizens came to the West, saw the benefits of living under liberal democratic systems, and took those values back to the Soviet Union, so that when Mikhail Gorbachev's twin policies of glasnost and perestroika took hold, these citizens were in effect equipped to best take advantage of those. So I would agree with you. I think isolation is a terrible idea. I don't think it in any way serves anybody's interests.
Yeah, hi, my name's Jonathan. I work for Intent Consulting. Referring to, I guess, the title of the presentation, could this not be seen as an opportunity for Western E&P companies? As you stated, the deal with China is yet to be concluded. Russians need a market for what they produce, so possibly they're on the back foot. A good time to strike a deal if you're a Western E&P company?
Yes,
your entry into the market?
Yes, I don't see why not. Russia is obviously vastly dependent on its exports of hydrocarbons to the West, particularly to Europe, and for all intents and purposes is probably more dependent on Europe buying its oil and gas than Europe is on buying Russia's oil and gas. So certainly, you know, the opportunities and the chances there now. As I say, this gas deal between Russia and China has been decades in the making. President Putin is convinced that it will happen within the coming weeks. Historically, the issue has been that China was not willing to pay the price that Russia wanted it to pay. I don't think that issue has gone away. Indeed, since these negotiations last took place, China's discovered large reserves of its own shale gas, has signed any number of energy deals with the Central Asian states, Turkmenistan, for example. So China is in a better position to negotiate than it was previously. Russia is in a worse position because Russia now needs a market or wants to diversify by looking east. Absolutely, if Western companies, you know, are willing to risk, in inverted commas, dealing with Russia, there's no better time than now.
Okay, thanks. Stay there a second.
Okay.
Thank you for that. I just need you